Exil. My novel is about exile. Exile is a space of in-betweenness between the past and the future, between home and a foreign land, between belonging and estrangement. For exile to be understood, I think it has to be understood beyond just a location. It's a state of spiritual alienation, but it's also potentially an action of hope. The characters in my book choose exile as in a response to a potential annihilation or eradication. And so they choose foreign lands in order to not be subjugated in their homeland. So exile can be very, very mixed. There's hope and sadness. There's loss and promise in exile. Culture. Culture is a complicated thing. It involves identity, language, traditions, rituals. And in a country that is colonized, culture is often the site of a lot of negotiations. And for my characters, whether they're refugees living in Nepal selling trinkets, jewelry on the side of the road, or they're in the West in a space of academia among professors talking about their culture and seeing stolen artifacts around them. Culture is always being consumed and traded and claimed. And in this novel, I'm interested in thinking about how culture is a part of the dynamics and the tensions and negotiations of many different people claiming one place and one culture. Tibetan culture has traditionally been exoticized and treated as a fantasy and claimed by other people for hundreds of years. Whether it's Western Europeans or now Chinese colonizers. And so for Tibetan people, our culture is the site of our survival as well. It's not just about land, but it's about an identity that we're trying to keep alive. And my characters show what that looks like on a day-to-day level, on a day-to-day basis, whether you're in Nepal, India, Tibet, Canada, wherever. Famille. My novel is essentially the story of a family, and like many novels that are about families, there's many complications. There are characters who want many different things, and there's often a messy side, a side of loss. My characters leave their homeland and in the process lose family members on the trail into exile, and then have to form new family members or new families in exile. And so I think the particular experience of family in my novel is one of rupture, fracture, like shards of broken glass, but also being recomposed into new shapes through new relatives that are created in exile. Often my characters call people that aren't relatives sister, brother, uncle, aunt. And that's a pretty typical experience. And I think that it shows how important kinship is for my characters in order to survive and to find joy. When you lose like everything, you lose your homeland, family is often all you have left. And then that becomes almost the most important thing. But then that can also create a sort of a burden for some of my characters. The love and the sort of desire to sacrifice or to make other people's sacrifices meaningful or worthwhile, that becomes a kind of a burden as well. So, like I said, families are complicated. There's joy and there's burden, grief, sorrow. It's all mixed in there. Histoire. This novel is often called a historical novel, and that's a really interesting and loaded term, especially because I'm writing about a community and a people whose history has been deliberately either erased or ignored. And I'm especially writing about Tibetan refugees. Refugees are not typically served by historical record. There weren't a ton of books about Tibetan refugees that I could just access. So it's different from being a French author writing about a moment in French history. You could probably find dozens and dozens of books about any moment, any year, any month in French history. That's not the case for Tibetan writers. And so this book was a process of rebuilding a history that hasn't been captured in text. To do that, I went to the Tibetan Oral History Project, which was a lot of recordings of Tibetan elders, video recordings, and I read a lot of transcripts and I pulled stories from there. I also sourced a lot of conversations and stories that I'd had with relatives and friends over the years. And I didn't use all the stories, but those stories really deeply informed my understanding of the decades before I was born. I also traveled to the border of Tibet and Nepal on foot and spent 15 minutes at the border, which is all I was allowed to do. But that was a really important way for me to understand physically what it felt like to leave a country on foot and to take that trail. And so there were many things like that, but essentially through a constellation of data points, I was able to compose a history that did not exist in the written record. Fiction. Fiction is a really interesting terrain because a lot of Tibetan literature is either in poetry or in nonfiction. We have a long, long tradition of poetry in the Tibetan literary canon, centuries old. And nonfiction has been really important because of a desire to tell our true stories. But fiction, I think, is really important as well to explore and to enter into because it's one of the only art forms I know of where you get to embody another being's experience, their history, the way their mind works, what it feels like to be them in their bodies. These things are all accessible. And in this novel, I occupy 4 people's minds and bodies. And stories. So that allowed me to really expand my muscles, I guess, and to try to understand what it's like to be these characters and to, I guess, really provide a more prismatic or multi-perspectival narrative about this time and this community and this particular history. And fiction ultimately is also poetic and artistic, and it's a search for language. It's a search for a language and a form and a narrative that could hold an entire experience and a worldview through art. And so what I'm trying to do here is find a language to tell that story and to render a community in art.